Thousands of mourners gathered for the funeral of Sid Hatfield, the largest in the history of the Mountain State. Samuel B. Montgomery, the strikers' favored candidate for governor in the prior election, delivered what was less a eulogy and more a political speech. There can be no peace in West Virginia until the enforcement of the law is removed from the hands of private detective agencies and from those of deputy sheriffs who are paid, not by state, but by great corporations, most of them owned by non-residents who have no interest in West Virginia's tomorrow. The outpouring of grief and frustrations was not isolated to Mingo County. Union officials and like-minded individuals from across the country condemned the murder of Hatfield and Chambers. And even with the death of a high-profile individual, it appeared little would change in the coalfields until direct action was taken en masse. Dejected miners and others sympathetic began to gather to grumble across the state, and some began to converge near Charleston, but unsure where to go from there. Mother Jones arrived in town and met with Keeney and Mooney, the District 17 leaders puzzled on how to respond to Hatfield's death. Jones organized a rally held August 7th at the fairgrounds near the governor's home. They agreed to send one more list of demands, this time directly to the desk of Governor Morgan. Morgan rejected all of the Union suggestions and was defiant at continuing martial law in Mingo County. One miner would later state, "The time has come for me to lay down my Bible and pick up my rifle." A letter reportedly from Keeney reached miners throughout the Charleston area, stating the Union would be spending every last dollar and willing to spill blood if it was necessary to liberate Mingo County. By August 20th, thousands of miners were in the process of gathering along Glens Creek. They brought with them their rifles. Some brought home from the Great War. Some were veterans donning parts of or all of their old uniforms, while some went in the very clothes they mined in. Just about all of them were marked with red handkerchiefs around their necks. Rednecks. Worried about the possible bloodshed that could happen if this redneck army marched on Mingo, Mother Jones called another rally on August 24th at Glens Creek. She brandished what she claimed was a telegraph from President Harding himself, promising to dismantle the gunman system if the miners returned to their homes. Keeney was suspicious, and when he grabbed for the telegraph, Jones yanked it away, telling him to go to hell. Keeney turned to the ground, calling the telegraph fake and shockingly calling the famed labor activist fake as well. After receiving confirmation of its fraudulency, the Army broke camp late that night and moved south up the hollow and crossed into Boone County. As they passed through villages, more armed men joined their march. It's estimated their column would eventually swell to anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000. To reach Mingo, the Redneck Army would have to pass through Logan County. But it wasn't the treacherous terrain that may stop them, but rather the county sheriff, Don Chafin. Don Chafin had a long history of being firmly opposed to the Union, being paid well by the companies to snuff out any Union incursion within Logan County. In his 12 years in various political offices, he controlled the press, monitored the trains, and was the bane of existence to just about every miner. Chafin was prepared for just the sort of a march the Redneck Army was conducting. In 1919, there were threats of a similar march through Logan County. During that time, Chafin had scouted out potential defensive positions, settling on Blair Mountain and the Spruce Fork Ridge the peak was a part of, near the northern county line. He had the battlefield. All Chafin now needed was his own army. He had it in the form of hundreds of citizens who had volunteered to be deputies shall an armed march occur. They were roused into action in the morning of August 25th by the sound of Logan City's fire alarm. A commissary was set up in the courthouse, arms handed to the deputies who were joined by the company guards, including Baldwin Phelps. They then took to the ridgeline and began constructing rifle pits, falling trees to be used for headlogs and trenches, and blocking the few dirt roads that passed through the mountain gaps. Chafin was in constant contact with Governor Morgan, who allowed Chafin free rein on how he saw best fit to defend Logan County, but was ordered only to defend, not march to attack. By August 26, the lead elements of the Redneck Army arrived just a few miles from Blair Mountain. "We'll hang Don Chafin from a sour apple tree" was sung to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The Army had spent their march raiding company stores for food and additional weapons, including a Gatling gun. Keeney had been given conflicting views. Publicly, he told the reporters he had washed his hands of the matter, that the march was out of control. In private, he was having Mooney pull Union funds to purchase additional supplies. The federal government was at last starting to grow concerned, sending Major General Harry Banholtz to Charleston. Banholtz called the District 17 leaders to the governor's office, where all came to the agreement that the march had to be stopped. Late that afternoon, they organized a rally at a ballpark in Madison, West Virginia, where Keeney, while standing on top of a taxi, warned the miners that if they continued, they would not be fighting armed guards, but rather federal forces. Mooney aimed for the miners' patriotism, affirming the Union would not support fighting the federal government. Banholtz even inspected the encampments of the miners, assuring that the federal government would see the peaceful dissolution of conflict. Chafin began to pull his deputies from the earthworks. It appeared that large-scale bloodshed had been averted. Keeney, Mooney, and Banholtz departed for Charleston on August 27th, leaving Union official Bill Blizzard to oversee the evacuation of the Redneck Army. Mooney had distrusted the aggressive and at times hot-headed 28-year-old in the past, but being childhood friends of Keeney's won him the trust of the district's president. Even with the public intentions to withdraw, Keeney wanted Blizzard to have a vanguard of armed miners ready to go into action at a moment's notice. It may be the continued presence of armed miners occupying Logan County streets that coaxed Chafin to go forward with the most controversial action thus far in the conflict. 2 weeks prior, a party of armed miners had surrounded and disarmed deputies in the town of Cloyper. He chose the night of August 27th as the right time to cross the Spruce Forks Ridge and execute the arrest of the perpetrators. He contacted Major Davis for reinforcements, who sent Captain Brocus with a party of 90 deputies and state constables to Logan. Brocus and part of his detail moved to Hatfield by train, where Chafin had established his headquarters just a few miles behind the crest of the ridge. Under the cover of dark, Brocus led a contingent of state police over the top and down Beach Creek. Between them and Cloyper lay the small town of Sharples, heavily occupied with parts of Blizzard's advance guard. Entering the patch villages of the Boone Coal Company, they began to apprehend armed miners indiscriminately. When they managed to emerge in the lights of the porch of Boone No. 2's company store, they found the road blocked by a dozen of armed miners. Both asked for each other's reasoning for being out at night and armed. Then someone fired a shot. In the brief firefight that ensued, 2 would die, 2 more would be hurt. Word of the shootout spread in all directions, the facts being grossly inflated. When miners heard claims that women and children were being shot by Chafin's private army, they hijacked the trains which were to take them home and began speeding back to Blair Mountain. Civilians sensed full-scale fighting was inevitable and deserted their homes. Jack Brinkman, an Indiana traveling pianist who was in Danville for a performance, was met on the platform at gunpoint, forced to admit loyalty to the cause of the march, then fell into line and would help in the capture of free trains. Armed miners filled coaches and boxcars. When there was no more room, they climbed on top of the roofs and clung to the planking as they were hurried to the front. Fred Estep of Blair watched as miners poured to the base of the mountain by the hundreds. There was a different feeling, he claimed. Men were uneasy and scared, talking of watching every point on the mountain so they would not be surprised again. They went through quite fast, with very set, determined expressions on their faces. Inspecting the situation for Governor Morgan, Union official A.C. Porter ominously compared the hysteria to Belgium at the onset of the Great War. A monster powder keg awaiting one of the smallest of sparks to launch one of the bloodiest industrial wars in the history of the world. On August 29th, Governor Morgan reactivated the state's National Guard, naming Welsh native William E. Eubanks colonel and immediately moving him to Logan to take over command from Chafin, about 3,000 deputies, state police, mine guards, and volunteers as well. Many had devolved into raiding the stores of Logan and Ethel, drinking heavily, including Eubanks. Even at this critical hour, many still doubted that a true confrontation was truly going to occur. Keeney and Mooney were advised to flee the state until the Redneck Army could break into Mingo or be destroyed, heading to a hideout in rural Ohio by the start of September. On the evening of August 30th, Blizzard sent 2 parties of miners out from Blair to gather intelligence on the defenses of the mountains. One of them was commanded by a minister named John Wilburn, who famously said before going to the front line, "The time has come for me to lay down my Bible and pick up my rifle." Somewhere along White Trace Branch early the next morning, they came in contact with a party of free armed miners in the fog. When either side could return the proper password, shots were fired. In moments, Logan County Deputy Sheriff John Gore and two more deputies were dead. A black Union miner named Eli Kemp was mortally wounded in the back. Jack Brankman and one of Wilburn's sons tried to help Kemp off the mountain, but he was dead by the time the party got back to Blair. The Battle of Blair Mountain had finally begun in earnest. By the afternoon of the 31st, thousands of miners were advancing up the hollows leading to the top of Spruce Fork Ridge. Parties trying to flank around Blair Mountain were held back by machine gun nests. Frustrated, miners began advancing north, probing all along Chafin and Eubank's line, seeking weak points, but were driven back. A separate column of miners began advancing out of Jeffrey and up Hewitt Creek. They set their sights upon Crooked Creek Gap, which was reported to be thinly defended, but hundreds of rifles and two machine guns pinned down a party of 80 miners led by Brett Castle. Castle recalled later two younger miners who were veterans of the Great War tried to flank one nest, but were killed in the process. At least 6 or 7 bullets were lodged in both of their bodies. Ed Reynolds led a second push, his party armed with the Gatling gun. They advanced up Craddock Fork. They managed to position it on a hill opposite of a small fort constructed by state police. Reynolds then gave order to blast down into the fort. For over 3 hours, close quarters firing echoed from Crooked Creek Gap, till one of the machine guns manned by Baldwin Felt agents jammed. Chapin ordered for a second offensive to be hastily dug around Logan in anticipation that the miners were going to break through. The timely arrival of anti-Union volunteers from McDowell managed to create a new front line less than a half mile to the southwest. September 1st opened with the seemingly endless clatter of rifles and machine guns cooking off at one another across a nearly 10-mile front. It seemed like the whole place was coming down on you, one eyewitness described the ambiance. Chafin took to the offensive. Governor Morgan's orders forbade him from advancing his troops forward, but it had said nothing about the skies. For the past few days, Martin bombers of famed Great War pilot Billy Mitchell circled over Blair Mountain observing the movements of both parties. Mitchell had hoped to put them in action to demonstrate how aviation could be used in civil disturbances. Washington, D.C. would never give him this approval, but Chafin was convinced he could do it himself. He rented out free biplanes from the Logan County Airport, equipping them with homemade explosives that consisted of nails, tacks, and chemicals. Then, for the first time in American history, bombs were dropped on U.S. civilians. Although multiple runs were made, none of the rounds hit their targets. The gunfire up in the ridges was beyond deafening. Just about all of the Logan defenders at the front line had cotton swabs lodged within their ears for protection. Aspirin was always close at hand to numb their headaches. Ammunition was continually rushed up from Ethel and Logan by the carload, allowing Chafin's army to compensate for the numerical disadvantage by firing the machine guns nonstop. Newer parties of miners moving up from the front were of poor discipline and took to the nearest tree when the first spray of bullets came near them. They shot wildly from behind trunks of wood and from the cover of the uneven ground. Neither side could properly gauge if and who was inflicting more casualties. All they knew was they seemed to be in for a long slugfest. As night settled across Blair Mountain, the rate of fire seemed to only increase. Miners started lighting small fires in a bid to misdirect the shooting of Chafin's men, which proved to achieve little. Friendly fire was a constant threat, made worse now in the dark. Because of the indiscriminate shooting, a Union miner claimed, "You were more likely to be shot in the back by your own troops than you were the opposition." On September 2nd, it appears that the miners shifted their focus to Blair Mountain itself. An intense firefight erupted as two parties of armed miners attempted to flank around both sides of a fortified position near Blair Gap. It was on Chafin's right flank that parties led by Red Thompson had been trying to break through since the battle commenced, most likely to move down Dangerous Run and jump down on Ethel. "We was to fight our way through," Fred Hall, a 19-year-old member of the Redneck Army, later claimed, while recovered in Logan hospitals from wounds sustained on the stomach. For the 3 hours on the 2nd, miners dug in on Blair Mountain and shot it out viciously, nearly cutting off the deputies and volunteers. On the morning of September 3rd, as fighting continued on Blair Mountain in the Bridgeline, famed Great War correspondent Boyden Sparks arrived at the front lines trying to get information to report of the actions. Approaching the top, a hail of machine gun fire poured across Sparks' party of reporters and miners. Sparks was shot clean through his leg, then mistakenly taken prisoner by state police. Sparks' presence on the battlefield, however, signaled the arrival of outside forces and the end of fighting. When Bandholtz got word of the full-scale fighting, he tried twice to send in aides to talk to the Redneck Army to stay it out, to no effect. The UMWA sent their vice president to Blair Mountain to try to call a ceasefire, he being threatened by the Redneck Army to go back to Charleston. With the West Virginia National Guard and state police fully engaged in battle, Governor Morgan had exhausted his option to stop the fighting. Finally, pleas were heard for federal intervention. President Harding signed into action a proclamation that cited West Virginia in insurrection, allowing for federal action to be necessary. Harding commanded for both sides to cease hostilities by the noon of September 1st. If not, Bandholtz would be authorized to lead federal soldiers into battle. When the deadline was blatantly ignored by both sides, over 2,100 men of the 14th, 19th, and 26th Infantry Regiments boarded trains and advanced upon southern West Virginia. They began arriving by September 3rd, while some miners tried desperately to break through Chapin's line northwest of Crooked Creek Gap. As word spread of the arrival of the Federal Army, the Battle of Blair Mountain subsided. In the 3-day battle, casualties were remarkably low, with it being believed approximately 30 men from either side were killed. 3 U.S. airmen died near the West Virginia-Ohio border when one of the Martin bombers sent to do reconnaissance crashed in a storm. Over 1 million rounds are estimated to have been fired during the battle. A rainstorm settled over the region on the afternoon of the 3rd, as members of the 14th Infantry Regiment relieved Chapin's army from their breastworks. When Blizzard learned that the U.S. Army's intention was to disarm any man found without a permit to carry, he realized the surrender of arms would be grossly lopsided and put the Redneck Army at the mercy of Chapin's men. Instructions were sent out for the miners to hide their firearms within the trees and brush so they may at least surrender unarmed without suffering the charge of illegal gun possession. Officially, the U.S. Army would only process 80 weapons from the Redneck Army. Aside from the permit dispute, however, the Redneck Army fully cooperated with the U.S. Army because they believed the U.S. Army were here on behalf of President Harding to intervene and stop the coal operators' oppressive rule. But once the region of Blair Mountain had been secured and both parties sent back home, West Virginia was once more given back over to its authorities. It would be state officials who would decide the outcome of these mine wars. Over 1,217 indictments for insurrection were returned by grand juries in Logan County. Of those, 325 were charges of murder and 24 were indicted for treason. Bill Blizzard's trial was the highest profile, held at the Charlestown Courthouse in April-May of 1922, the same courthouse in which John Brown had been sentenced to death. But for Blizzard, evidence was greatly lacking and conflicted of how much authority he truly had over the Redneck Army. Some, such as the grandson of Frank Keeney, believed Blizzard was merely acting out the orders of the District 17 president. Others, however, looked at Blizzard's aggressive track record and began labeling him the general of the Redneck Army. Regardless of speculation, the jury found Blizzard not guilty on all charges, a Pyrrhic victory, as those still on strike in Mingo were at their breaking point. After spending over $2 million into the strike, the UMWA District 17 were on the verge of bankruptcy. Had the Redneck Army broke through at Blair Mountain before federal intervention, maybe things could have played out far more dramatically in the Union's favor. Instead, Keeney and Mooney's aggressive push to unionize southern West Virginia had failed. They resigned their positions as Union membership plummeted from 50,000 to just a few hundred by 1925. It would take a full decade for the Unions to regain strength and return to West Virginia, thanks in part to the Franklin administration and its New Deal policies as a response to the Great Depression, which pushed businesses to cooperate with unions the majority of their workers supported. But the alterations of the government as a result of said depression would mean more labor disputes that occurred to the present day, some peaceful, some violent. but nothing since in U.S. history has compared to the level of violence that had gripped the Mountain State during the West Virginia Mine War. The Battle of Blair Mountain remains the largest insurrection since the American Civil War, the biggest land battle in the continental U.S. since that war, and yet one will find next to no mention in the history books of this conflict. There is just one state marker along the road between Blair and Hatfield, a blink and you'll miss commemoration.